Hi, and welcome. My name is Tara Needham. I am the Assistant Academic Director at the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. We are an institute that advocates for the continued study and relevance of Hannah Arendt and her work, as well as supporting a range of programs and publications that are inspired by her style of bold and risky thinking. And tonight's event is in that spirit. And I'd like to welcome everyone. Because this event is on Zoom, we have both people from the Bard community, students, we have people from our virtual reading group who have joined us, and people from really anywhere and everywhere. And we're so pleased to have just a diverse audience with us. So tonight's event is the first in a series of Thoughtful Tough Talks. Thoughtful Tough Talks is a student-run initiative here at the Hannah Arendt Center that is part of our Campus Plurality Forum. And the goal is to create a civil and respectful space for meaningful conversations around potentially divisive issues. To this end, the initiative offers speakers, attendees, and student hosts the opportunity to engage with and experience ideas and the people who hold them that may challenge their own prejudices and convictions, as well as to articulate and communicate their viewpoints on, objections to, and criticisms of a particular position. As Arendt writes, only in the freedom of our speaking with one another does the world, as that about which we speak, emerge in its objectivity and visibility from all sides. As I said, this is a student-run initiative, and part of the program is that we involve at least 3 student fellows who work at the center, invite the speaker, and host the events. Tonight's fellow, I'm pleased to introduce, is Maggie Huff. She'll correct me later, is a sophomore at Bard, planning on majoring in classical studies. In addition to being a Tough Talk fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center, during her time at Bard, she has served as a member of the peer review board, a member of the Classics and Philosophy Club, and contributed as a translator to Sui Generis. She also started a student group in spring of 2021, supported by the Experimental Humanities program, which engaged in a semester-long study of Shakespeare's The Tempest, as well as hosted a guest lecture from a Shakespeare scholar currently at NYU. She plans to put on a production of The Tempest this spring. And I just want to mention that we have 2 other Tough Talk fellows on the call, Leo Cronin and also Ismael Vicente Delgado. And we have more Tough Talks planned for the spring. But without further ado, I hand this off to Maggie, and welcome Maggie and Anna to our forum.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. Brief outline of the proceedings. I'm going to briefly introduce Anna, and then I'm mostly going to let her speak for herself. She's going to give a brief talk about her work, and then I'm going to pose the first question. I'm going to open it up to the Hannah Arendt Center staff and my fellow fellows, and then we will open up the questions to the group. So without further ado, Anna Halpine is the founder of the World Youth Alliance, a global organization empowering and educating young people with their human dignity curriculum to advocate for the inviolable dignity of every human life from conception to natural death. The organization is involved in the UN and other intergovernmental organizations to bring about their vision of the future. She served as the YA president from 1999 to 2007. She has her master's in philosophy of religion from Yale University Divinity School and a Bachelor of Music from Mount Allison University in Canada. She's the current CEO of the FEMM Foundation, a research and evidence-based program committed to offering a new model of healthcare for women's reproductive health. She lives and works in New York City. Anna, take it away.
Thanks very much, Maggie, and thank you to the Hannah Arendt Center for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be with you all, even though it's still virtual, but I look forward to having this conversation together. I'd like to just start by outlining how the World Youth Alliance began, and then share some of the key reflections that we had on this topic of human dignity as we begin this conversation today. The World Youth Alliance was founded almost 24 years ago in March of 1999. I was invited to attend a UN conference on population and development. And at this conference, a small group of young people were given the floor, and they stood up and said, "We represent all 3 billion of the world's youth, and these are our demands as young people." They demanded abortion as a human right, sexual rights for children, and a deletion of parents' rights. At a conference on population and development, they didn't address any of the basic needs confronting most of the world's people, needs such as shelter, clean water, education, basic human development. So I went back into the conference the next day with day-glow pink flyers that I had printed at Kinko's, broke the rules, gave these to all of the delegates. And these flyers basically said that I and many other young people were not represented by this small group, and that we had a very different idea of human flourishing. And this idea was rooted in a respect for the dignity of each and every human person. This caused pandemonium. For 2 hours, the negotiations were stalled. And in that time, the world divided. The Western states spoke with this other group, but many of the developed nations came up to me and said, "Thank you." They said, "Thank you for being here. Thank you for presenting these other ideas." And they invited us to found a permanent presence at the United Nations and to come to their countries and work with their young people. I went back into the UN the next year for another conference, this time on women. And a very seminal amendment was proposed at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is when many of the difficult negotiations happen at the UN. This is, in parentheses, often because small delegations struggle to man a delegation and manage to keep up with these debates on a 24-hour rotation. The negotiation amendment that was proposed at that early hour from the United States was very, very small and very short. And it simply said, "Human rights grant human dignity." Human rights grant human dignity. And this was a very important moment for me because, of course, this is the reversal of the Human Rights Project. The Human Rights Project is based on the idea and the recognition that the dignity of the person is the basis and foundation for human rights, recognizes that human rights are, in essence, legal tools that bind states, and that there's a precursor to those binding instruments, which is this recognition and reality of the intrinsic and inviolable dignity of each and every human person. So I was very struck by this and realized that we're debating many, many issues at the UN. But I think that ultimately the UN remains a place, as Eleanor Roosevelt said at the beginning of the UN's existence. It's a place that is a bridge where the peoples of the world come together. And what they debate is not, I think, so much the topics that are discussed, but I believe, and that evening clarified it for me, that ultimately what we are debating are different visions of the human person and how those different visions are impacting and moving forward towards human flourishing. That led to the founding mission and principle of the World Youth Alliance, which remains our mission today, which is to defend the dignity of the person in policy and culture. We recognize that the dignity of the person begins at the moment of conception, extends through natural life, that this is first and best nurtured in the family, and that this respect of the dignity of the person forms the basis for building free and just societies. We also set to ourselves the task of thinking through more deeply what this question of the dignity of the person might actually mean. And of course, we found a richness of experience and thought that come out of the same background of that Hannah Arendt comes from as well. That crucible of the Second World War and its aftermath, which led to so much suffering but also led, I think, for many to such clarity about the essence of human dignity and human freedom. So I just want to share a few points that have been central to us, that remain core for us in the work that we do with young people, and in the training and study that we do together as a central activity of the work of the World Youth Alliance. Nuremberg was an important starting point for us, which is of course the beginning of the modern human rights project. And Nuremberg wrestled with the question of what were we even evaluating in setting up a court that was looking at the actions of the German people in respect particularly of the Holocaust and the treatment of the Jews. What Nuremberg functionally, as I understand it, came up with was this challenge that all of those participating in the Holocaust were following orders and following laws. And so there was this challenge of positive law, the law of the land, versus something that Nuremberg identified, which was this knowledge written into the hearts of individuals of when we must oppose those laws that are so manifestly unjust that they no longer tie us or bind our allegiance to their following. So this is the delicate framework of Nuremberg in first setting up the court for the war crimes and the travesties of World War II, but in setting up also the legal foundation for human rights. So there's something knowable to us. It's knowable and it's in the heart of every human person that allows us to somehow have access to these universal, binding, knowable aspects of human dignity and human rights that are written on our hearts. And that these bind us prior, sometimes, to the positive and legal laws of our lands. And many other people helped us to clarify and think through that. Viktor Frankl is a Holocaust survivor. He was a thinker and writer in Vienna. And he wrote a book that many of you have undoubtedly read called Man's Search for Meaning. And in it, he said two things that have always been very important to us in thinking through this question of human dignity and human rights. He said that at Auschwitz, he had the experience, as with others, of being shackled and chained. But he said, we also realized in Auschwitz, where we were fully shackled and chained, where everything seemed to have been taken from us, that we were still free. We had the freedom, he said, to think about the way we would respond to our circumstances. And in demonstrating this, Frankl made two examples that have been very essential for us in understanding these ideas. The first, he says, is that he observed over and over both men, prisoners, and guards who would risk their position in order to save a crust of bread and to give it to someone who needed it more. And this, Frankl said, was freedom. It demonstrated to him that capacity for freedom that we all have, even in the most horrific and constrained circumstances. The other thing, which is of course the title of his book, was the theme of what man or women needs to survive. And Frankl said that his job, he realized, as a doctor, as a psychiatrist in Auschwitz, was to go to the men every day and remind them of the particular meaning and purpose they had to try to continue to live. He said in Auschwitz, men died of many things. They died of pneumonia, they died of cruelty, they died of starvation. But Frankl felt that they died first by losing their meaning and purpose, and that made it so easy then for other things to take them away. And so he speaks of working with the men and reminding them of the book only they could write, of the husband only they could be, in the hopes that their wife or their children, the father they could be. And these were the reasons that made them aim for survival, even in those bleak and horrific circumstances. So Frankl taught us many things about human dignity and many things that are at the heart of how we understand human freedom. Another person that we looked to was the French philosopher Jacques Maritain. And Jacques Maritain worked on many of the drafts that then became the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. his comments on those initial drafts came back over and over, pointing to the same thing, to say, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have agreed on a set of principles that men of diverging faiths and beliefs have arrived at. We have avoided the hard work of figuring out how we get there, but we have agreed on these principles. And he said, this is enough for great work. It was, Maritain believed, a very important step towards building a framework of human rights that everyone could work towards. But Maritain wrote a caution in those initial essays about the Declaration of Human Rights in saying that if the hard work was not done to establish an understanding of the why for these rights, or in other words, the subject at the heart of these rights, who is that subject? How do we understand that subject? Then Maritain worried that human rights would merely become another tool that would be used in the hands of the powerful and less effective in protecting the rights of all, especially those most vulnerable and least powerful. So this was another important place where we went to understand and study these terms and ideas. Finally, another area where we, and I have been greatly inspired, was understanding the writings and the thinking of the Solidarity movement and those in the Velvet Revolution and other movements. Solidarity talked to us about this idea of a forest of awakened consciences, that if each person became a light, they could light together a forest which could move in overcoming a totalitarian regime with peaceful means. And this, I think, is the great gift of solidarity to the world in showing us one of the pathways to do that. Václav Havel wrote about that through his experiences with the Velvet Revolution, and in his famous essay speaks to us about the greengrocer. The greengrocer, as he maps it out, is the man who is running his grocery store. He is trying to keep his head down. He is trying to avoid all the rules and regulations of living in a totalitarian state. And in this sense, he is presented one day with a sign which says, "Workers of the world unite," which he is asked to place in his window among the tomatoes. And the greengrocer places that sign. But one day, Havel says, the conscience of the greengrocer awakens. And as that conscience of the greengrocer awakens, the greengrocer begins to think and move towards this idea of living in the truth. And he comes through this process to see that what he has placed in the window does not represent some idea that he wishes to live by. It is something else. It is a slogan of those who are using this in order to create a totalitarian way and in order to suppress these conversations that are based on the truth. In other words, the greengrocer comes to understand that by placing this sign, which seems at first glance to be so innocuous, that he is himself participating in living a lie. And one day, the greengrocer realizes, despite the great risk to himself in removing that sign, a risk that he understands could mean his door could be closed, his children could be removed or barred from school, his wife could lose her job. Despite all of these consequences, the greengrocer decides that he will in fact remove the sign because he is now ready to himself live in the truth. These men are capturing an experience that they lived, and these movements in which many people lived all across Central and Eastern Europe under totalitarian regimes. And they also helped us to understand through the crucible of their experiences, the deep commitment that it does take for us to reflect, to try to be awake, and to try to commit in very small ways every day in our own lives, to live always for the truth, to try to awaken ourselves to do that. And that this also is a way which we can express and live freedom in our lives, and express and live and maybe even touch in some sense that human dignity that we have, and that certainly also arises in everyone around us. So we really came to understand that this is a question, we believe, which is at the heart of the Human Rights Project. It's a question that I believe is at the heart of many of the debates that take place at the United Nations today. It's a question that's broader than that. It touches all of our societies, and I think it touches all of us in the ways that we think about it, or sometimes try not to think about it. And this is the work that's at the heart of the World Youth Alliance, is trying to always understand who is the human person, what is the dignity of the person, what are the sources that we can go to understand this that are consonant with the experiences we also can have, and the ways in which we can try to live this reality and experience of the dignity of the person in each day and in each of our lives. So I'll pause there with that overview of our thoughts and the commitments of our organization towards this as our central mission, and look forward to the conversation that we all might have together.
Okay, thank you. I think before I ask you my true question, I'm going to ask you to just expand quickly on what WIA and FEMM actually do. I really loved the conceptual philosophical outline, but a lot of people don't know about these organizations. So if you could expand on that, and then I'm going to ask my question. For example, what was WIA actually responding to? What did you think was off about what those other people that came into the UN said about what the 3 billion youth need?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. So the World Youth Alliance has, as I've said, taken this core mission as the defense of the dignity of the human person. We believe that human dignity to be present from the moment of conception through natural death. And so in that sense, when we encountered these young people who were promoting these limited ideas, the promotion of abortion and sexual rights at a conference on population and development, we felt that we were certainly not meeting the needs of those people that were supposed to be represented at this conference, and that there was an insufficient approach to recognizing and safeguarding the dignity of each person in there. The World Youth Alliance is global, so we have offices in 5 regions of the world. We train and equip young people to think through these ideas and then represent those ideas in public spaces. We maintain a presence at the United Nations, where we participate and share our ideas in conferences that range from questions about population and development, so global questions of population, questions about youth, demographics, sustainable development. And we also participate in some of our regional debates where our young people feel questions related to the dignity of the person are being presented in national or relevant fora in which they are located. And out of this experience of policy, let's say, and global debate on certainly some of these tough and hot button issues, we came to see that over and over there was certainly a very heated political discussion, often about women's health and women's rights in that area, and also about approaches to education and sexual education for children. And so that led us to the development of 2 programs that we have, let's say, now developed and tested in some way, where we attempted to say, is there a way for us to find a better way forward so that we can take this idea and commitment we have of the human person and put it into action in a way that can solve more for us what we are trying to accomplish. So FEMM is a women's health program that seeks to provide preventive healthcare to women and improve outcomes by getting to the root cause of any conditions that she has. And I'm happy to elaborate further on this, but I'll leave that to the Q&A so that we can talk about whatever questions are of actual interest to you. And the other program that we developed is a curriculum for schools for K to 12, so elementary schools, called the Human Dignity Curriculum. And the Human Dignity Curriculum is a 1-unit program per grade, which really seeks to introduce these ideas of the human person to these young children in age-appropriate ways. So the HDC poses questions like, who is the human person? what is the difference between a subject and an object? What is human freedom? What are habits for human excellence? And how can young people apply these types of ideas to their lives through friendship, through choices that they are making that are relevant to them at various ages. So again, I'm more than happy to discuss or provide more examples, but hopefully that gives a broader sense of what our organization is and what we've tried to do to think about these ideas and put them into action.
Okay, thank you. I think my first question is, so you explain WIA as being a response to these people coming into the UN and making an assumption about what the 3 billion youth of the world need. And I guess my question is sort of a reversal of your response to them, which is, do you think in a different way, your organizations make an assumption about what the world needs, especially because they're pedagogical in nature? You have two organizations that have a curriculum, a human dignity curriculum, and then a curriculum training women to show other women to be in tune with their bodies and be aware of their own reproductive health. So do you think that in a way is making a different assumption about what the future of humanity needs and actually sort of shaping the world around that assumption?
Well, it certainly is. So I think the work of the World Youth Alliance, like the work of most organizations, has a worldview. Certainly the World Youth Alliance is very clear and intentional about the worldview that we espouse and that we're trying to understand. So we absolutely are, let's say, making assumptions or certainly making claims about who we see as the human person, trying to clarify what we mean when we talk about the dignity of the person, and then trying to provide an understanding and a possible solution, let's say, to the implications that we believe that has. So I think the legitimacy, excuse me, the legitimacy of the World Youth Alliance comes from the fact that we state our claims. Our members are young people who read our charter. They join us in sharing these convictions. And we seek to bring that voice to the table and to find ways to share that voice and to communicate what we believe this looks like in actually bringing this to policy and culture.
Great. Okay, I'm going to open the questions up now. I may return with questions because I have a lot of them, but just start coming in with questions.
I'd like to pose a question. Anna, thank you so much. It's really interesting to learn, in particular, how you contextualized your organization within the 20th century, and really as a kind of resistance to, aligning it with a resistance to totalitarianism, to Nazism, to, and so I guess part of me wants to know how much of an imposition you feel like you're still working under, and how much of a room in your vision of the world and in your vision of human conception is there for choice, for women to choose, say, their own definition of human dignity that doesn't include human conception as the point of origin for it.
Yeah, so thank you. And just to clarify the first part of your question, or should I just really respond to the second part of your question?
No, please clarify, because I may have misinterpreted and I don't want to mischaracterize for you.
So I'm happy. I'll start with your second part of your question. And then I think your question before that is like, are we making an imposition on women or on others maybe by sort of claiming an intellectual tradition or line in the thinkers that I've identified. Is that correct?
The connection between that lineage and the kind of impetus for your organization was not sort of self-evident to me. There seemed to be some players that were either not fully disclosed, or I just wasn't. I mean, I was surprised by that narrative of your lineage.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, I think we can all recognize up front that there are, two very different ways, let's say, that we could shape this conversation. So, certainly there's, I think, a narrative or an approach to human rights and women's rights that would say, let's say, all of the thinkers that I identified, they've inspired women to come to a totally different conclusion, to say women have a right to choose, and that's that is the legitimate human rights approach. So I think that would not be surprising to anyone on this call, and it's certainly not surprising to me. And so I hear what you're saying, that what's surprising is for me to say, well, how do I have some legitimacy in saying that these ideas that we are looking at come from this same root of maybe shared thinkers, or maybe there's even a perception they aren't shared. But so I'm definitely going to make the claim, and I think we can be generous to make that claim, that we have these shared historical experiences, we have this shared philosophical and lived experience, and now we emerge at a time in history where we now have divergent ends. That, I think, is precisely the purpose of these kinds of seminars, and I'm certainly not surprised by the question. And it's I think certainly something that we encounter all the time at the UN. What I think is, we do find a legitimate pathway to those ends. That I guess what I would try to explain on my own side is that these are difficult questions, and in terms of talking about abortion or women's right to choose, which is, I think, what your question really hinges on, we are not, by saying that the human person has dignity from the moment of conception, we're not invalidating any of the difficulties that are in these decisions that women face. But what we are saying is that where is the other line for us to draw in identifying some point at which the human person is or is not endowed with dignity? If we're not bringing together the knowledge we have of science and the knowledge we have of philosophy, and here we can also bring in, let's say, the hard knowledge of human experience, which is also history, and which in a very painful way is the history that so many went through and suffered through and bestowed upon us. I think that the big challenge we have, and I think this is not to demonize one side or the other, but is really to wrestle with and to recognize that at every time in history where we have a question about who is a part of the human family or not, the way in which those who are excluded is by dehumanizing. And I guess one point that I would like to make clear is that for us and for me, that very small amendment that I mentioned, human rights grant human dignity, struck me so powerfully, precisely because I think that it does point to this challenge that let's say we as the human family face. If human rights grant human dignity, what I take this to mean is that the state has the ability to define human rights. And if the state is granting a right, the state can rescind a right. The state is also, in this instance, defining what those rights are and who has those rights. And so this is something that is, I think, deeply part of the tragic history of the 20th and the 21st century. And I think that these questions are present and with us again today. And so we arrive at this point then of saying every person has human dignity, and the moment at which that dignity exists is the moment of conception and must extend through human life. Now we have many other things that we have to wrestle with, and many things we wrestle with can be very painful and challenging decisions. But I think that we can weigh and accept both of those things. We can accept that here we are talking about the dignity of the person, and we can accept that we have suffering and sorrow, and we have challenges in how we're going to respond to different questions as we go along. But I think that when we do clarify our terms, and if we arrive at the terms as I arrive at those terms, then the hope, of course, is that that will change and shape the way that we walk through the challenges, both when they affect us personally and when they affect those around us. So I'm happy to answer the follow-up question, which is very obvious, or that may be sufficient.
No, thank you very much. That was really thoughtful and really clarifying and generous. I'll let someone else ask a question.
Yeah, I see Rachel Saunders has a hand up, so I'm going to ask you to unmute, and then you can ask your question.
Hi, this is actually a really interesting conversation. I think Anna's spelled it out really, really well. For me, it's interesting that you've used abortion in framing the conversation. Hannah Arendt lays out in Origins of Totalitarianism the idea that the basic idea of the right to citizenship, as you were saying, state power, enabling rights. And it's interesting with Texas's current abortion laws, UK government are also trying to be able to remove citizenship without judicial process. And also the current occupation of Ukraine by the Russian government are all symptoms of this idea of citizenship being ephemeral, and that rights and responsibilities can evaporate at the whim of people at a higher level within the state. So how are you tackling that educationally? How are you trying to look at that from a teaching and pedagogical perspective? This intrinsic idea that to stop it being ephemeral, that your connection of dignity and rights flips that script. How are you being able to teach that and bring that through to the next generation?
So I will certainly rely on you and others on this call to help me understand, or even understand, the teaching of Hannah Arendt. Like many, I've read her most inspiring quotes, but I can't pretend to know her thought. As I understand your question, it seems that you're looking to say, how do we flip this script between dignity and rights? So should I take that to mean what the conflict is, or maybe I just don't understand the initial part of her thought enough to frame this for me to answer you. You've been muted.
Sorry, yeah, I put it back on me. Yeah, it's just basically, it's this, I'm part of my PhD, I'm looking at taking Arendt's ideas into the digital sphere and reconceptualizing rights, not just as state rights, but also the rights we have as digital citizens. and that if you don't have literacy or you don't have understanding, that your rights are eroded because you can't either reciprocate in terms of your state responsibilities, but also you're not aware that your rights are being eroded. And in terms of human dignity, that's a very interesting concept, because as digital persons, if we have that inherent dignity, that means that there is a whole slew of inherent rights that come from that process. Whereas often it's the other way around, that the rights that we supposedly have intrinsically, they're eroded on a daily basis because other people and other entities seek to squish and squash and pigeonhole it, so that the identity that you exude is always slightly less than the dignity you have as an inherent person. And I'm interested in how you teach that. If you're giving lectures to anyone in high school or below, how do you convey that idea? How do you flip it from being here are human rights to actually saying you are a person with dignity, and therefore your rights flow from that? Because that's different from how the traditional set of rights are usually educated.
Yeah. So setting up the paradigm of the dignity of the person being the foundation of rights rather than a rights-based approach. Yeah, that's exactly the approach that we do take. And I have just a story to share, because when I was in Lebanon many years ago, and we spoke with a lot of schools and school children, so middle school, early high school. And as we spoke to them about the work that we do and the ideas that I've shared with you, this had a really transformative effect on them. And some of the children started to comment to say, we live in a country where we are told, or we experience on a regular basis, this idea that our rights are being violated. And this has, let's say, the effect of erasure. Like, what do I do when my rights are taken away from me? Do I no longer exist? Do I no longer have any value as a human person? And so the idea that, in fact, we could hold in tension two things, that we could say, you have this human dignity, and this violation of your rights is a violation of that dignity. That was an incredibly powerful concept to them. And I think it was healing for them, and it restored a deep sense of hope, because it allowed them to say, yes, my right, or even deeper, my being has been violated by these experiences I've had by someone or some entity whose purpose is to protect me or to validate me. Still, that experience of a rights violation does not diminish the worth of that person or diminish that intrinsic human dignity. And that was a really profound moment for us. And in fact, it was at the invitation or request of the principal of the school system that we were meeting with in Lebanon that we began to develop the human dignity curriculum. So it took us many, many years to figure out the question you're asking, which is, how do you take graduate level complex ideas and teach them to 4 or 5-year-olds? And that has, the younger the age, the harder the work has been. But I think what we have ended up with, to try to give a summary, is some very basic core concepts that we work with age to age. So we start by introducing them to the hierarchy of being. We start by just introducing this concept of human dignity. We introduce, as I said, and then at later ages, we introduce more or less. But in kindergarten, we really do that. And then we try to apply it as is appropriate to their lives. And their sphere of life at that age is really their friends and their family. And so the whole curriculum is trying to help them really understand and apply these terms to their life. What does it mean for me to understand I have this human dignity in how I treat my friend? What is my freedom to act according to my human dignity? Well, at this age, it's choosing not to be distracted in class. It's choosing to be kind to my friend or sister. It's choosing to tell the truth and stand up to the classroom bully. Those are very, very small examples, but start to build, I think, a framework of recognition of the truth of who they are and what it means, even at a very small age, to live the truth, and hopefully to experience a little bit of the freedom of that.
Okay, thank you. I have another question that's going to turn back to the abortion issue, if we don't mind. And please, everyone, think about your questions because I want to hear from more people. But my question is, I mean, I think a question that's central to this talk specifically, but also Tough Talks in general, is a question of how should we, or should we even reconcile and collaborate with organizations and individuals whose work shares some of our goals, but whose principles and vision of the future may differ. And I'm sort of shooting that question back at you because FEMM offers, as I understand it, sort of an alternative healthcare system for women so that they have the opportunity to be listened to and really listen to their bodies and what they need. And there's other organizations that claim to do the same thing, such as Planned Parenthood. So I'm asking partly for you to expand on what exactly FEMM does. What does your app do? What does your curriculum do? What is even your definition of a woman? Who are you advertising your whole structure to? And then also, if you have any interest in Planned Parenthood, if you acknowledge that they have similar goals to yours, or if you would rather that they don't exist.
Thank you, Maggie. So let me try to explain a little bit about FEMM. So FEMM, let's say, we work in a number of different ways. So we have an app, which is, let's say, direct to women. And it's an app that allows them to download and track the signs of their own body and cycle. We also have an educational course for, let's say, FEMM teachers or health educators, where we teach them the science of a woman's cycle and try to teach these women how to work with other women to understand what's happening in their body and what's healthy and normal, what are healthy and normal variations, and then what's not healthy and when should they seek more help or medical help. So this would be something like severe pain or very challenging mood swings or too much bleeding or too little bleeding. These are all the kinds of symptoms that we would say we want to get more help. And our medical providers are looking to diagnose and treat the underlying condition. So a big part of what FEMM is looking at is the relationship between women's health and hormonal health, let's say. And so a lot of what we're doing is lab draws on a complex range of more than a dozen hormones to try to say, is everything at the level that it should be at the right time? And can we help to correct or stabilize that health so that we have better health outputs and results? So FEMM is really looking at a preventive care model, I would say. We say ovulation is a sign of health. All of this hormonal activity is a proxy, or ovulation is a proxy for that hormonal activity. And so we're just seeking to help women understand how their bodies work. Let's say enhance their informed consent in knowing what that process is in their body, and then provide them with support for education or medical care as they go along.
Just to clarify real quick, is FEMM against all forms of contraception? Is that the mainly the reason for tracking your ovulation, or is it just for health purposes?
Well, our FEMM app users indicate that they use the app pretty 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So 1/3 for tracking their health, 1/3 for avoiding pregnancy, and 1/3 for achieving pregnancy. So let's say fertility is a sign of health. So when these hormones are balanced or in the order in which they should be, it's, let's say, obvious for a woman to understand her fertile time and then to manage that according to her desires. FEMM is thinking about contraception maybe in a different way from the way you've just posed that question. And the way we're thinking about this is really to say the science has moved forward and advanced. So we know that hormonal health is necessary for brain development, for blood, for the sodium. It's necessary for bone density. And let's say in adolescence, what's really happening in that adolescent body is the maturation of the hormonal axis. And so that hormonal axis maturation is dependent on hormonal activity that needs to be happening in a certain way at a certain time. And that's structuring the entire body. It's structuring the neural pathways. It's structuring her bone. It's structuring her metabolism. And so that's really what FEMM is aiming to provide. Now, what's different about our approach, obviously, think to anyone listening, is that we're saying more or less, we would say, and of course I can put this in Planned Parenthood's terms as well, but we would say that instead of putting a Band-Aid on those women who are receiving contraception for health reasons, we can diagnose and treat that underlying cause. And so we know from Guttmacher, which is Planned Parenthood's research institute, that 2/3 of women in the United States are prescribed contraception for health reasons, which is to say the management or support of all of these very legitimate side effects we mentioned: acne, mood swings, weight gain, weight loss, too much bleeding, too little bleeding, pain, mood swings. And so for those women, FEMM offers, I think, a science and evidence-based and very legitimate alternative model that allows them to have the choice to diagnose and treat those underlying conditions and restore health. But obviously there are lots of other questions and I'm happy to get into them, but I wanted to at least try to outline clearly and at least a little bit separately what we think, what FEMM is to continue that conversation. So I think if we want to tackle the contraceptive question head on, this is a more complex area in my experience with FEMM than it was before FEMM. So I'll give one example. We have a clinic in Columbus, Ohio, and we serve more than 1/3 of our population is Medicaid. So we had 2 Medicaid patients that came in around the same time. They were not on contraception, very overweight, and both in long-term sexual relationships with no intention of having a child, but also not on contraception. They simply weren't thinking about it because they had not ever gotten pregnant. And they weren't getting pregnant because these women were not healthy. So as we started to explain this to them, to say, we're going to start to, take a look at your hormones. We're going to try to aim to restore your health. As we restore your health, your fertility is going to return. And that's in fact what happened. They began to lose weight, their hormones began to balance, and we could show them and see that their fertility was returning. And so we encouraged them to learn to understand their body, to learn to understand and chart and manage those returning signs of fertility. We encourage them to have these conversations with their boyfriends. And their boyfriends were part of this process as it unfolded. They were understanding the health implications. But what I can tell you is these women were thrilled to be losing weight. They were thrilled that their skin was clearing up. Their boyfriends were walking along with them. And both of these women came in for a pregnancy test the same week. And no one was surprised. We were not surprised, and they were not surprised that it was positive. This had been a process that was unfolding for a long time. What did surprise us was that both couples came back the next week merely to tell us that they were engaged to be married. And they wanted to share that with us. And I think what happened was that the work that we were doing with them, which was limited to their health, which was engaging this question of fertility as their health was being returned to them, opened a conversation between those two couples, between the men and the women, that allowed them to see, we have a healthy relationship. We're now finding ourselves pregnant. We tried to avoid this question, is I think the way to actually think about it. But they were neither surprised nor shocked nor very much alarmed. And in that process, I think they had found themselves in a very human situation to say, we're ready for this step, and we're ready for this next commitment. So that is not part of the mission of FEMM, but I think that it is a mistake for us to, again, try to draw too hard of a line between the dignity or the humanity of the person and healthcare. And healthcare, especially when you're engaging something that's so intimate, your body, and then when that body is engaged in something so intimate as a sexual relationship with another person, and a relationship which has that possibility of fertility, of bringing forth new life, those are lines that, in my experience with FEMM, are so much stronger than I ever would have thought, that I think it's at least worth all of us thinking about, that the way we treat the body, the way we heal, and the imperative to heal, and the way we think of, therefore, women's health, something almost sacred. And so we do our best, at least, to honor that and to provide what we see as the best. Now, what we offer is not what every woman wants at all times. And I think what we are able to say at FEMM is, here's our invitation to you. This is the healthcare that we offer and provide. And of course, a woman may find herself in a place where she does not want or is not in a position to receive what FEMM is doing. We cannot balance and suppress her hormones at the same time. And so FEMM's message to that woman is, if and whenever you find yourself in a position where this is what you want, we are here ready for you. And I think that at least what we can see is that many women have felt very underserved. And I think what we have also experienced as we've dug into the science is that women's health is so politicized. But in fact, we often offer very little health care to women. And that's a hard thing for us to say. But I think that's something we have to also examine and maybe at least come to an accommodation of offering additional opportunities for those who may want them.
Great, thank you so much for your thorough answer. I think Roger has a question, so I'm going to let him ask that, and then Ismael Vicente is on deck.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Maggie. I think that all of us can agree and take some and be chagrined in some way by your rightfully saying that the feminist movement around certain issues like healthcare and reproductive rights has at times sought to speak for women and all women in a way that doesn't speak for all women. I think that's a fair statement. But you try and talk about human dignity, and I have to say, I mean, I've sort of at a loss for what you mean by human dignity. You've used, like, as far as I can count, like almost 15 or 20 different definitions of it, which is not surprising because I think it's a very difficult thing to define. But let's start with what you said in one of your answers, where you said that you go into these young kindergarten classrooms and you teach these kids to, I don't remember exactly what you said, but stand up for themselves, have respect for themselves, do well on a test. I forget exactly what you said, but that's a fair characterization, that there's a certain idea of dignity in being someone who can speak for oneself and have that voice. That strikes me as as a meaningful insight and a meaningful program. First thing I'd say is that there'd be many countries in the world where teaching women to do that would be considered to be a violation of the country's idea of dignity, and that the word dignity, which comes from the Latin dignitas, was traditionally regarded as only available to men, and especially prominent older men. So the idea. I mean, I happen to find what you're doing for these young kindergartners and teaching them to speak for themselves and have a sense of who they are and be able to articulate their views and their opinions. That's actually an approach I fully embrace, but it's one that may very well lead these women to reject the cultural and sometimes religious dictates of their societies, and may lead them to say, that out of respect for myself, I should have a right to define and when I should have a baby and whether I should have to carry a baby, and that my human dignity requires me to have a kind of bodily integrity that allows me to control my body. And if I do get pregnant, it's my body, and my dignity gives me the right to do that. I guess I find the language of dignity is always a nice and meaningful. We use it, and yet again, what is dignity? You say dignity begins with conception. I mean, Hannah Arendt, again, didn't get involved in abortion debates so far as I know, but she thought dignity had lost all its meaning in the modern world. The whole premise of the book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, is that the subterranean streams of our history have swept away the idea of dignity and the dignity of our tradition. She also thinks that human rights, honestly, as you rightly said, are state given and therefore not very valuable. In her mind, the only truly human right is the right to speak and act in public in ways that matter, going back to Viktor Frankl, to matter in the world, to be meaningful. And that means to have the right and the ability to have people listen to you. And that goes back to your example with these kids. But it's not the right to stay alive, because all humans are going to die. She doesn't think there's a right to life. She doesn't think there's a right to housing. She doesn't think there's a right to any of that. There's a right to be meaningful, and part of being meaningful is to die meaningfully. And it strikes me that that's actually a very old Christian idea of many of the Christian sects about how to have a meaningful death. And so the focus on life at all costs, and then especially at life at conception, seems just very confused to me and seems very arbitrary, and comes from, honestly, simply, as far as I can tell, a political viewpoint. Has very little to do with any sort of history of the idea of dignity, any philosophical ground of the dignity. I mean, the Christian idea of dignity comes from that man is in the image of God. Okay. But the Kantian Enlightenment idea of dignity is not that. It's that man is a rational being. That's not Arendt's idea of dignity, because she doesn't think that we can claim that all men are rational or that all men are in the image of God anymore as a tradition. She thinks that dignity is in man's natality, their ability to start something new, their freedom. But there's just different, the idea that it's simple, that dignity comes from conception, just doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't know where you get that from.
Well, thank you for your comments. I'll just kind of say I agree with a lot of what you've said as well. And I think maybe a couple of remarks. One is that your remark, for instance, that our ideas the dignity of the person or other things I've said could get a woman into trouble, for instance, in certain countries. I agree with what you've said, that there are things that are worth doing because they're right and they're hard to do. And in some instances, they might lead to death. So I think there are lots of examples that we could all identify of a commitment to certain ideas or ideals that we think are valid and maybe even more than valid, true, self-evident, somehow ingrained within us, and communicating or committing to those ideas by us or by someone else can lead to hard choices and can lead us to suffering and maybe death. And as an aside, I think that's likely what has inspired so many of us about the Ukrainians right now, who are fighting for something to the point of death. The other comment that I might just say is that I do agree with your concept of bodily autonomy and the statements that you made in that regard. But I think where we have a disagreement is in this challenge, let's say, of subject versus subject. So my conviction and the World Youth Alliance is that at the point of conception, a new human life has emerged. So now we are no longer in this subject-object experience. We're in a subject-subject experience. And I know there's disagreement about that, but that is how we resolve that particular question. Now we're face to face with the I thou, as Buber would say, and it's no longer an I it. So where we have a subject-object distinction, the subject is stronger. We can call that human dignity, we can call it subjectivity, we can call it maybe rationalism or pre-rationalism. There are a lot of aspects, but I guess what we are saying is that there is in the human person a value that is unique and intrinsic.
Anna, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
When in history did this idea of human personhood begins at conception emerge? Because it seems to me a radically non-commonsensical scientific idea. I mean, until I don't know when, 18th, 19th century, people didn't even know there was a thing. And I mean, maybe they did, I don't know. It just seems, you saying it's a person. No, but an I thou, who talks to the fetus? Like, I mean, it's not a person in any commonsensical idea. And so I'm wondering how this sort of proto-scientific or quasi-scientific idea of the fetus as a proto-person gets imagined in this debate as a person beginning at conception. I mean, even for a woman who feels something growing inside her, which women who are pregnant often do, that's at least a few months in, it's not at conception. So I just wonder where this idea, which seems very ideological and very, arbitrary, I guess, and not commonsensical, when it emerged in history. Do you know?
Well, maybe I would say a few things. I take the point of human life to be conception as a scientific fact. So if we want to confer personhood on that beginning of human life, that seems to be the question. But through history, and I think also to today, there's a very strong indicator of the value and respect or the personhood. I mean, that's a kind of technical debate in a certain sense of human life. So in the Jewish tradition, we have the Psalms and the scriptures that talk about, I knit you in your mother's womb. Before you knew me, I knew you. And this, of course, is central to the Jewish understanding and reverence for human life, which then informs the Christian tradition. We have Aristotle, I think, recognizing the sort of beginning or value of human life at quickening. So from the scientific moment where we understand something is happening, we place a value on it. As you say, women have this experience. I mean, there are beautiful stories of mothers who are singers, who sing to their child, and their child very obviously recognizes that voice, but also the father is a violinist and plays to that child in utero, and that particular melody or that particular violinist is it changes the heartbeat, it changes the whole physiology of that child. So
But not a conception.
well, I think we have to agree to disagree. That from our perspective, what do we say at quickening, at 6 weeks, at 8 weeks, from the time of current viability? That viability metric is changing all the time. That's a factor of technology, not science. It's we're learning more every day. We can perform surgeries on children in the womb at very early ages. We have all sorts of fetal and scientific knowledge that tells us this is a member of the human family. And now we might say a member of the human family who's not rational or sentient or isn't able to express some meaning or purpose in their life is not a member of the human family. But I think this is a very dangerous road for us to walk down, because it is always very easy for us to remove the rights of a group of people, or certainly the most vulnerable. And so this is why we attach this idea of human dignity. We could also call it membership in the human family, to every person or every being, from that moment of conception until natural death.
Thanks.
Okay, I think Ismael Vicente, it's your turn to ask a question, and then we'll turn to Christopher McIntosh.
Sorry, I'm just debating with Zoom about whether I'm muted or unmuted. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Maggie, for this talk. You know, Roger, I was going to ask about conception. That's where I was headed, about the space of conception. But I think I'll turn to development instead. And I was curious how, inside of the program that you had mentioned, I believe it was the Human Dignity program that you used to kind of like frame the pedagogical structure for the young children that you're teaching. What kind of like behaviors are key markers of development for the organization? Like, what do you see in a child as a representation of the dignity that you're imagining? That part I'm just very curious about.
I mean, what we're looking at in the curriculum as what we're measuring, let's say, or looking to see, is behavior and attitude change. So here we have tried to learn from educators in the field. And so what that behavior and attitudinal change looks like is very, very simple at these young ages. And so what we believe that should be reflecting back to us is that they understand the concepts, but they're able to apply them somehow in their own lives. And so we're trying to, again, teach them freedom, maybe as, you know, another way in which we are talking about this question of freedom is agency, but I think trying to also elevate it to say these are actions that are worthy of a human being. So agency, and I defer to you all in the ways in which you might use this, but really what we're trying to say here is, what are the ways I should be acting in such a way that I am reflecting the dignity I have as a human person and the dignity you have as a human person. And so the very concrete outcomes that we are seeing and that we're looking for are changes in behavior and attitude that these children take about their own lives. So very simple things. I stop distracting others in class so that I learn and so that they can learn. I decide to do my homework before dropping all of my books and playing video games. I choose to respond to my parents when they ask me to do chores, kindly and well, not having to be asked twice. These are the very simple actions or case studies that we're introducing at the very young grades. Then as they get a little bit older, we're introducing that sphere of friendship. So now, what does it look like? I see a bully harm another kid in the class. Do I speak up and tell the adult or the teacher what really happened when they ask, or do I look down and pretend I didn't see? These are cases that are very close to them. Nothing in the world, but only trying to help them have, let's say, an intimate framework of what it means to act well, for us, acting according to their human dignity for themselves and others. Are they gossiping? Are they making fun of the new kid? Are they laughing at someone's foreign accent? Are they just saying mean things about the kid who has some obvious deformity or other characteristic that stands out? Trying to teach them to recognize something deeper, something shared, which is this human dignity and this capacity that they have to use their freedom in recognition of that end. So this is the structure of the grades, sort of K through 8. And then in high school, we introduce the world. So trying to map on those developmental capacities and abilities. And we introduce a vertical in each grade now. Now they're still assessing this language of the human person, of the person as subject, not object, of freedom as acting treating each person as a subject and not an object. Maybe that's a better phrase than human dignity. But the vertical is looking at ways in which we violate the dignity of the person and highlighting appropriate ways that we think to respond to that. So in grade 9, the vertical, the violation, is racism and slavery. Again, the heroes are people I think we all agree on. We look at Gandhi and we look at Martin Luther King. In grade 10, we look at the Nazis. This is the violation of human dignity, Nazism and the theories and philosophies. And we showcase quite a bit the White Rose movement. These are young Nazi resistors who are almost their own age at that point. In grade 11, we look at totalitarianism. So we look at communism and fascism. And we look at resistors, who were the dissidents, who were those brave enough to stand and risk everything. And in grade 12, we look at modern human rights abuses. So we look at abuses in population control. We look at gendercide or female feticide. We look at other abuses that we see in different areas around the world. So that's the structure of the curriculum, and that's how we try to put some teeth on it so that the concepts they're growing with are matching their developmental ages.
Okay, thank you. Christopher McIntosh has a question, and then Bella and Aaron will call on you.
Can y'all hear me? Yep. Thanks. I guess I'll start with saying I guess I'm confused about sort of where you're coming from with a lot of these questions. A lot of the answers you're giving are quite thoughtful and recognize the possibility of multiple viewpoints. Keep saying I agree to disagree. The issue with conception is complicated, et cetera, et cetera. Yet the way I understand your work is very much not in that spirit. right? It very much is an activist effort, and it's an effort that has resolved these questions one way or the other, in particular with the life begins at conception issue. So I guess the question I have is about the human dignity curriculum, which, you know, as occasionally people refer to it as sort of a pedagogy, but I wonder why that's the case, because it seems to be an initiative that's designed to inculcate people with a particular viewpoint, right? It's not to expose people to a variety of ideas, but to teach people this is, you know, the way that natural family planning can work, or, you know, the notion of the family, or LGBTQ rights, right? Or other thinly veiled conservative Catholic ideas, right? So I guess my question is about one particular complication that exists there, which is the way I understand the World Youth Alliance and what I've read about it and what I've read on the website and what you described is that part of where it arises from is a dispute within 1999, and part of what you were disputing was that children should not have sexual rights, right? They should not have, that parents should have rights in terms of educating their children. And so my question is, you talk about human dignity, what human dignity do LGBTQ youth have, particularly those whose parents disagree with whatever actions they take to live who they are as a dignified individual? And the other question I have along those lines is with the World Youth Alliance, the charter says explicitly that the family is the crucial unit. It is the father and the mother. And so I wonder, is there space for same-sex couples, or does it also follow sort of conservative Catholic preachings and conclude that those are that those are unacceptable, and those are something not to be supported, those are something not to be you know, worked with? And along those lines as well, human dignity curriculum, given that the second part of it, at least on the website, talks about sex education, which is something you seem to be downplaying, does the sex education merely speak to, you know, sort of men and women and this idea of the family, or does it, you know, open the possibility of the panoply of other relationships that very much constitute dignified families that deserve, you know, recognition and support?
Thank you. So I do want to clarify just your first comment that the World Youth Alliance clearly does take clear positions on some of these difficult questions. So I don't want to pretend that we don't, or to try to avoid or give the impression that we don't take those positions. They're clear, and we do. In saying, you know, we have these different positions here, I'm referring to just our conversation here this evening. The World Youth Alliance takes a very clear position that every human person has this thing that we're talking about that is, as Roger and others have pointed out, hard to define, and we don't definitively define it, but that every person from conception till natural death has this dignity, has this value, has this this reason to be received and welcomed and treasured, regardless of any other condition in their life. So that most certainly applies to anyone, including, as you say, LGBTQ individuals. That's our position, and that's clear to all of our members. We also say, as you point out in our charter, that the family is the place where we believe this human dignity is nurtured and passed on to individuals. That family is often the family of generation, the mother and the father that bring that child into life. You have a question?
Yeah, the question I have is, it doesn't say often, right? That qualification is very much not there. And I think if you, I mean, do you really think if you ask the World Youth Alliance members that they would accept that qualification? That it's
No,
only,
I'm not trying to introduce that qualification. So you're right, that qualification is not there. We don't take a position on LGBTQ families, is where I was going to go. So our work is seeking to defend the dignity of each and every human person. It's looking to defend the right to life of each person as part of that human dignity, and to defend the family as people find themselves in it, as the unit that we think is the place where the child is nurtured, introduced, and taught their own dignity through the experience, the subjective experience of love. And also that the family is that mediating institution between the state. So those are the ways and principles in which we talk and work in this area. And then you had a final question or comment, which I can't remember.
I mean, I guess the question was about the sex education curriculum in particular is if part of the origin story of the World Youth Alliance is advocating for parental rights when they conflict with children's sexual rights, in particular, you know, high schoolers, for instance, how does that respect the dignity of these youth?
Yeah, so we're not trying to hide the curriculum that we're developing. So we have a handshake, let's say, it's in development, which is why it's not yet on our website. There's no sex education in the human dignity curriculum. FEMM is developing a program called Teen Men and Teen FEMM to help children understand the changes that they're experiencing in their bodies as they grow through puberty. So those programs are in development. We're getting feedback, working with schools, and that's where we just teach them. It's a physiologically based program, and we teach the boys and girls differently so that they have a free space to understand the changes they're experiencing and to learn about that. The primary comment we've received there has actually been from the boys, who have almost always and unilaterally come back and told their teacher, today we learned about ourselves. So I think that's a really important feedback item we've received, particularly when I think so many boys hear a lot about toxic masculinity and want to know what it means to be a man, and let's say a man who's not toxic, and what that model looks like. So I just want to clarify, we're not trying to hide anything, but that content is not in the human dignity curriculum. World Youth Alliance does advocate for parental rights. So we think those are important. Again, we think it's important that parents have the ability to choose the education and other aspects for their children when they're minors. These are enshrined in treaties. They're enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so that's a process through a lot of UN documents separate to the convention. The convention recognizes the child as a child to the age of 18 and under the authority of their parents or family. Other UN documents talk about the evolving capacities of the child. So that's an undefined term that isn't identified or allocated to age. Now, we all know that there are circumstances children get into where their parents are not the best protectors or defenders of them. They can be abused. They can come into various conflicts, such as the ones that you've articulated. And these are challenges, I think, that we all face. But World Youth Alliance does recognize the rights of parents in raising and caring for their children, and again, in being mediators in systems of recognition that there are boundaries of the family for which the state does not have an immediate and direct entry point. So I think there are reasons for social stability, for non-totalitarian activities where we can look at these mediating institutions and recognize the right to protect them, even if we can also identify the other cases where those institutions may not always work properly or perfectly, and certainly where we can identify the cases where they're not working at all. And those are manifold for sure. But that's, I think, those are the challenges, obviously, that we face when we want to talk about policy, when we're talking about human rights. And to go back to a lot of Roger's points earlier, I think if we're going to talk about human rights, we have to wrestle with the dignity of the person, and we have to wrestle with universal norms. If we're not going to talk about human rights, we don't have to wrestle as much with these other things, or we can decide we're going to ditch them. But I think it's a challenge for us to pick and choose among universal norms and the dignity of the person in the preservation of rights and human rights. And that's something I think that we all have to face, and face the challenges that that brings to us.
Okay, Christopher, thank you for your question. Anna, thank you for your thorough answer. I think it's going to be the last one or two questions. So Bella and Aaron, whichever one of you it is.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, I'm not sure, I think this has been touched upon, but not explicitly asked. Whose person's dignity do we prioritize when the dignity of the fetus might impede the dignity of the mother that's carrying said fetus, if it is brought to life?
Well, I guess there are two ways to understand your question. One is if we're talking about the case where the life of the mother is at risk with carrying, or as you phrased it, a question of impeding dignity. Do you have one of those two different, are you thinking of it in one way or the other, or both?
Hi, sorry, I'm struggling with the mute. I would say thinking of it in both if they're at risk health medically wise, and then also with this definition of dignity that you've been using, whether that be like mental health that is impeded because of the birth, whether that be economic health that is impeded. Yeah.
Yeah, so on the question of, let's say, impeding dignity, as you put it, of mental health or economic challenges, I think from our perspective, that's very clear. There can be many, many challenges. They can be real and often are. There can be a lot of fear. All of that is something very valid, and it's something that needs to be recognized and affirmed in the woman. But it is not something, in my opinion, that contravenes the recognition of what I'm calling this subject, or this reality, this challenge that we have of having one subject, the woman, experiencing or endowed with this dignity or value, and now this new problem of another subject endowed with dignity. In the case of the mother's life being at risk, you run into a very different calculus. So if the mother's life is at risk, there are different ways of thinking about it. But I think the most common way of thinking about this is that one aims to save the life of both individuals. But if in that process, the life of the child cannot be saved, that child may die, but that child does not have to be killed or harmed or have violence done to it beyond what is necessary to save the life of the mother. So an obvious example can be raised of an ectopic pregnancy. In an ectopic pregnancy, the child, the fetus, the embryo, the zygote, whatever we want to call it, has no possibility of survival. And if the ectopic pregnancy is not identified and addressed, the mother, the woman, will almost certainly die. The embryo has essentially gotten stuck in the fallopian tubes, and as the child grows, those tubes will rupture, and the mother and the child will both die. So in the case of an ectopic pregnancy, it's absolutely imperative to save the life of the mother and to remove that child. And the process for doing that is that very, very small embryonic sac with the developing fetus inside of it is removed and dies almost instantly in that process. But there are many other instances where, again, we can see sometimes the life of the mother is what we are aiming for. The life of the child we are aiming for perhaps as well, but the child will die based on the surgery or the result that's needed. But there are choices in some of those instances about the ways in which that procedure will take place. So those are things that we can do now with scientific and technological advances. And those are maybe things we can think about when this topic emerges as well. But I guess just to clarify, which I think is your main question, World Youth Alliance and I also personally do not see, I think this is the sticking point for many people here, is that we do not prioritize one life over the other, even if that other life is very, very small and completely dependent on the woman, on the mother, and the physiological processes and support she provides for that life to grow big enough to survive on its own.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to close there. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Anna, for your questions. Thank you, everyone, for your answers. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful questions. I think this is a rare and good opportunity for everyone to have a dialogue with someone they usually wouldn't be able to talk to and really get to the bottom of your ideologies and where we can agree and disagree or agree to disagree. So thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Just thank you to Maggie for organizing this and doing such a great job hosting. And thank you again, Anna, for your time and your generosity of your response and talking with us today. So on behalf of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, we thank everyone for sticking with this event, those of you who stayed to the end, and we look forward to seeing you at future Tough Talks and other events. You can sign up for our newsletter and find us on the web as well and social media. Have a great night. Thank you.